is how can we simplify that certification process if we have different circumstances? I'll share my screen now and turn off my camera, and let's look at this new and exciting topic. Okay, as we said, we have the certification process for a typical gold standard project, which starts with project planning, the stakeholder consultation, and safeguards assessment we just spoke about. Then the project, once it's ready with its preliminary design, it goes through a preliminary review and obtains a listing status, right? After it's listed, the project developer can create the final project design, go through validation and design review, at which point the project is obtains a certified design or obtains design certification. And that happens once per project in the very beginning. And then at least twice per crediting period, we have verification, performance review, and issuance of any carbon credits, right? So we have the design, then we implement the project, we verify that we've implemented it correctly, we verify the impacts achieved, and we issue the corresponding products or carbon credits in most cases. That is called, the status is called certified project, and we obtain project certification. And at the end of the crediting period, if it is a renewable crediting period, we might have a renewal or a validation. A renewal of the validation and renewal of the design certification, so that another crediting period can start and the project can continue issuing products or claims. So this is a process that might be a bit complicated if we, for example, have thousands of households implementing a certain measure to reduce emissions, correct? So how do we deal with these situations where we have many different smaller projects, or we have many different smaller solar power plants, or we simply have a very small project that cannot afford going through this whole process as a very large project might? What we would like to answer here is, how do we reduce the certification effort? And what, if you remember from the previous fundamentals webinar, whoever assisted, you can find it online. There are different ways in which we categorize projects according to the certification stage, as we saw, which standard is used, the scale, whether it's an individual or group project, the project activity type, the methodology, which claims there are, whether it's emission reductions or something else, and what SDGs or Sustainable Development Goals that the project contributes towards. What we're going to focus on today is, how do we work with scale and the grouping of the projects so that we can simplify the certification process. Oops. Now, we have two general simplification approaches. One is basically, the smaller the project, the simpler the rules. For that, we have small-scale projects, which is something that has existed from the very beginning of the clean development mechanism, and it basically, we'll look at what small-scale projects have in terms of different rules to be able to go easier through the certification cycle. And we have micro-scale projects, or micro-scale scheme, which is a gold standard specific scheme that was established almost 10 years ago in order to be able to remove the barriers to certification for very tiny projects, especially those that have to do with rural communities or pilot projects of very tiny new technologies, etc., that might not be able to afford the full certification cycle, also because they generate very few emission reductions at the end. So The large-scale projects will be the full scope of certification. Then we have simplified methodologies and a few more tricks for small-scale projects. And then we have an even more simplified certification process for micro-scale projects. We'll look at more details in the following slides. And then the other approach that we can take is grouping. So if we have several activities or even thousands of activities that are the same or very similar, we can group them either in what we call distributed projects. This is not a term that we specifically use in the standard, but I'll explain. But it is certainly a type of project that is very common with code standards. So I'll explain what I mean in a second. And we have programs of activities about which we just spoke a little bit, and we'll hear more about in the next presentation. So we basically have the implementation happening in many, many different places, whereas we have one central certification in a project or a program, and that is the point of grouping. So let's look at small-scale projects. And the small-scale project requirements apply to both the small-scale projects and micro-scale projects, because micro are just a subset of small, right? There are limits to the size of projects and impacts achieved for a small-scale project. So that is defined by CDM requirements and certain methodology requirements and activity requirements. So methodologies, as you know, in gold standard come either from the gold standard's own methodologies that we have developed together with project developers, or we have recognized certain CDM methodologies. And in these methodologies that help you calculate the impact of your projects, there might be certain requirements of up to what size a project may be in order to claim the to be a small scale project. And activity requirements, there are 3 activity requirements under gold standard. One is for community services activities. This is the typical cook stove, biogas, safe water supply projects. There's renewable energy requirements for wind, solar, hydro, etc. And there are land use and forest requirements. So there might be specific limits to small scale projects there. So this is just how to define if your project is small scale or not. Then we have simplified methodologies. This is the big advantage of small scale projects, is that there are not so many safeguards within methodologies, because the scale of the project, the impact that is claimed is not as big as, say, the millions of tons that can be claimed by a large scale project. So if we limited the emission reductions to, say, 60,000 per year, then the risk is not so high. So the safeguards that the project has to go through and the things that it has to demonstrate are not so complex. Therefore, there are simplified methodologies for baseline determination and for monitoring plans for smaller scale projects. Then there is also simplified demonstration of additionality for smaller scale project on the same with the same reasoning. The smaller the project, the smaller the risk. So additionality assessment can be a little simpler. And then we also have the simplified project design document under CDM. So that is especially relevant to those projects that apply under both CDM and gold standard. And we also have lower issuance fees at gold standard. So if it is a gold standard VER project, a gold standard project that issues gold standard verified emission reductions, then the issuance fees will be lower simply because we have issuance fees per credit. So it's not per project. We don't say 10,000 per project for issuance. We say that much per credit issued. So the smaller the project, the lower the fees. And the larger the project, the larger the fees. Also, if there's underperformance of the project, then the fees would also be lower as, proportionally. So all in all, the small scale definition in gold standard is very similar to the CDM small scale definition, except if there's anything written in the activity requirements or any specific methodology that is developed by gold standard. Now, the microscale scheme. The microscale scheme is, as I said, something defined especially by gold standard. It's different than microscale definition in the clean development mechanism. And it comes in addition to the small scale simplifications. So whatever we just saw, if the project is up to mostly for non-LUF projects, it's 10,000 tons of CO2 per year, then we have several other advantages. For example, if it's a community services activity, then the project is directly deemed additional. There is no need for demonstrating additionality. The second simplification we have introduced is the validation verification fund, which creates predictability of the costs of validation and verification. Instead of the project needing to negotiate every year with a VVB, with a validation verification body, it knows exactly what the costs are going to be throughout the period. And even if the costs increase or decrease depending on the complexity of the project, the fees are exactly the same. So this is something that is optional for microscale projects to use. There's also reduced fees that we have introduced for preliminary review and performance review. These are the fixed fees that SustainCert is charging for these activities, or the gold standard certification body. And if the project is a microscale, then the fees are reduced accordingly. And the other simplification we have introduced is a so-called internal validation and verification. So microscale projects can choose whether they go to an external validation verification body that they prefer to work with, or they simply submit their documentation to the certification body, SustainCert, who does the validation and design review, or the verification and performance review together. At certain circumstances and at certain points of the certification cycle, there might need to be a visit by an objective observer. And that objective observer is not an auditor per se, but is someone that is local and that can basically check whether the sustainability outcomes and the safeguards, the safeguarding principles assessment are reasonable for this project. So it's a simplified type of validation and verification that is offered by the certification body. Another simplification that is introduced for microscale scheme is that new methodologies can be submitted as part of the project design document, and there doesn't need to be a separate process of submitting methodologies. So how do we define microscale scheme? That is according to the microscale project requirements and as per the activity requirements. So how big the project needs to be to qualify for micro is defined in the activity requirements. So as we said, there's community services activity requirements, renewable energy activity requirements, and land use and forests. So very important to note, there is a CDM definition, the Clean Development Mechanism definition of microscale, and that is different from gold standards. Go on. We have then distributed projects. These are projects, for example, cookstove projects where we have or solar home systems or solar water filters or home household biogas. These are projects that are many projects, many different households or buses in bus rapid transport systems that are too small to go on their own through certification. right? So what we have instead is we group them all in the same project. All these measures, there could be, let's say, 1,000 households. They only go through the certification process once. There is centralized management, one project developer that is responsible for all of the project. There's phased implementation, so the project could be registered, let's say, with or design certified with, let's say, 1,000 households participating, and that can grow over time to 10,000 or 20,000. So there could be it. You don't need to know all the participating households in advance. You could apply also sampling in baseline and monitoring, depending on the methodology requirements and the CDM rules on sampling and surveys. So you don't need to go and monitor every single household for every single parameter. That would depend on exactly the methodology and the CDM rules. And these distributed projects can be of any scale. They can be micro scale, and then micro scale requirements would apply, or simplifications, small scale or large scale. Of course, if you limit to micro scale, then you limit the amount of households that can participate in this project to they will be capped at the higher limit. Let's say if it's 10,000 tons of CO2 per year, the number of households, if you have 2 tons per households, you will be limited to 5,000 households that participate more or less per year. Please note that this can be also combined not only with microscale, but also with programs of activities. You can have a program of activities of distributed projects, and we'll see what programs of activities are in a second. What is important to note in this way of simplifying is that this is limited to one country only. You cannot have a distributed project that spans more than one country. And if you have underperformance of one area, let's say 200 of these households suddenly get a gas connection and start cooking on gas and don't use the cook stove, that would affect the results for the whole project. Right? The monitoring is done for the entire project. Now, compared to programs of activities, this is very similar. So we're also trying to group projects, different projects, not different measures like last time, but different projects together into a program. So we have one design certification as an umbrella. So for example, if we have several cookstove types in different regions, and then we can again have phased implementation. So multiple projects are included progressively. You don't need to know every project that will be part of the program in advance. It allows for different project developers. So you would have one coordinating or managing entity that is responsible for the whole program, but every project under the program can then be managed by a different project developer. You can also define various project types within a program of activities. You can have, for example, cook stoves in one project, cook stoves and water filters in another project, and only water filters in another project within the same program. You can have sampling, again, in baseline monitoring and validation verification. It can be composed of distributed projects, as we said. So it could be a grouping of groups in a sense. Programs can be multi-country, and there could be independent project issuance. So the underperformance of one project does not necessarily affect other projects. If a project is underperforming, you simply don't need to verify it, or you verify as 0, but the other projects get whatever they have obtained. It is, however, more expensive than one distributed project. So basically, we have all these options, and the certification process is, of course, more complex for a program because you have to have this whole umbrella certified and then real case VPAs, and we'll see this in more detail in a second. So I'll just give you two examples. You can have a cook stove microscale program of activities where you have, let's say, one project here that is in this region of the country that has 500 households, and this one has 300 institutions, and this one has another 200 households, etc., etc. So this program would use all of these simplifications that we talked about. It is distributed projects. It is a program of activities. It can take advantage of the small scale requirements, small scale methodologies, and also the micro scale simplifications. Whereas we can have also a solar power small scale program of activities that is not distributed. You have one solar farm here, another solar farm here, and then we have 4 solar farms that are small scale, that they don't have to be under the micro scale limit. I mean, a small scale in CDM terms will be a very, very large solar farm. But it is still a program of activities. So this could be independent project developers, for example, whereas everything is managed by one central entity and is certified once, and once one of these solar farms is included in the program, then the other ones can follow and the program can grow indefinitely. So these are the options that I wanted to present to you so that you are aware that they exist and that you can take them into account in project development and in the verification. Any questions you might have on this topic?
Thanks so much for that, Martha. There's a couple of questions, so if anyone has any more, please drop them in the chat. So Martha, I'm going to ask you, revalidation fees for project of activities or VPAs are not specified in our gold standard fee page. So is this the same as a normal validation fee, or can you provide some more details on that fee?
Oh, that is an excellent question, and I think we'll have to come back to you on this one in writing, but we will come back to you, Irem. Thank you.
Okay, and we have a second question here. So the second question is in terms of, so can borehole projects, so where there's a borehole located in a village that provides water to hundreds of people, can that be defined as a distributed project?
I mean, in a sense, there is no need to define something as a distributed project. What would be distributed project? Of course, I mean, whether new people come to the village and start using the borehole, the project can grow, right? You might attract more people in a village that has a running borehole than other villages that don't. I think what we mean by distributed project is if you have one borehole would probably not be sufficient to justify the certification of a project, right? So you might want to have not one borehole, but like group 20 or 200 boreholes together into one project, because then your certification costs, one validation is enough for all these 200 boreholes and not for just one borehole. So the emission reductions that you generate will then be able to pay for the certification of so many more boreholes. That is a bit the idea of distributed projects.
Cool. Okay, another question. So who will be qualified as an objective observer for micro projects? So I think maybe that could be who, and then maybe a bit about how as well.
Yeah, this is stipulated in the microscale requirements. And basically, the project developer can suggest 3 people to act as an objective observer. The certification body already has a roster of objective observers that we have worked with in the past 10 years. So if you don't have anyone in mind, then they will be able to help. But there are specific requirements, and they need to be usually either from an NGO, local NGO, or someone from a university, or someone that knows the local context and can understand, with a little bit of training, can understand whether the project can really achieve the sustainable development impact that it is planning to achieve.
So another question. So is design change requested only when there is a new technology? So are the same technologies covered by the CWS specified in the emission reductions from safe drinking water supply methodology considered as a new technology? So let me reread that again. I don't know if you got that.
I can read it. I can read it. Don't worry. So the idea is, if we okay, so the question is multi-layered. Do we
Yeah.
need design change when we add a new technology in a project or a program of activities? Definitely. Is that the only time when design change is requested? No. Design change might need to be requested also in situations when, for example, you change the monitoring plan because you have introduced, I don't know, digital monitoring of some sort. Or if you want to start using our brand new Sustainable Development Goals tool, and you want to align the indicators that you're using in your monitoring with those of other projects so that you can compare projects better before the end of your crediting period. So that would be a reason for design change. I am not sure what CWS means. From safe drinking water supply methodology is considered as a new technology. I mean,
We
yes.
can
So
take that and have a
I'm
look at it in the plan.
Iram, if you could just type in the chat if I've answered your question or you have anything else in mind.
I'm going with that you've answered the question. And I'm also quite conscious of time. So if there is no more questions for this particular section, then I think it's time to talk about program of activities, I believe.
Yeah, and I'll pass the baton now to my colleague Lokesh.
Thank you, Martha.
Thanks, Claire.